I just swapped my Nazgul Evoque V2 from O3 to O4 Pro, and I got a whole lot of jello and stabilization issues, which I've now got fixed. So I'm going to run you through what was going on in case you're running through similar issues and how you can get them fixed too. So first of all, I'm going to run into the shade because it's freaking hot out here, but just how beautiful do these palm trees look? So okay, let me get into the shade. Okay, I'm in the shade now, it's a bit cooler here, so let's carry on. So let me give you a brief history about this drone. So this is the Nazgul Evoque V2 and it's the F5 dead cat version. So I've had this for about 18 months and it's had a really easy life. I tend to look after my gear really well because if you look after your gear, it looks after you, and it's had, I think it's only ever had two very light crashes. I'm not even sure you could really call them crashes. So it's in exceptional condition. It always has fresh props on it. It's always sort of ready to go because I use this for a lot of my nice cinematography stuff. So yeah, I basically keep this in tip-top condition, which is going to come into a play when it comes to jello because I know that this drone is in excellent condition. So when I had the O3 in it, I basically didn't have any jello, nothing like that. But then as soon as I put the O4 Pro in it, I had jello coming from freaking everywhere. So first off, what I actually got was I got the iFlight official conversion kit, the upgrade kit. And when it first came, it felt incredibly tight when I put the O4 Pro in there. Like it was really hard to move it. It was extremely tight. I thought it was actually too tight, and considering it's supposed to be soft mounted, it seemed like it was being overly squeezed, and which was taking away a lot of that soft mounting effect. But I went out and I tried it anyway, and immediately I noticed that when I applied stabilization, I was getting a sort of rocking in my footage, a bit of jello, but it was just a gentle rock. And I sort of put that down to some noise coming through from the ESCs, because my ESCs were still set to 24 kilohertz. I didn't have any issues with O3 on that frequency, but it is a known thing that if your ESC is set to 24 kilohertz, you can actually create some electrical noise because the stabilization in the DJI system also is sort of running on that frequency. So I flashed my ESCs to 48 kilohertz, and that got rid of that stabilization wobble. It was post stabilization. In the goggles footage, I didn't see any of that sort of rocking in the goggles, but I did see a lot of jello. So going on from there, I was getting a lot of jello when I was doing sort of high throttle punches and when I was coming down through prop wash. Now coming down through prop wash, you tend to get a bit of shaking anyway, but this wasn't just shaking, this was actually jello. So I thought, let me loosen up the mounting a little bit just to give it a bit more of a soft mounting effect, hopefully giving sort of the camera a little bit more vibration dampening in order to improve the jello. So what I did is I sort of enlarged the holes a little bit on the frame just to give me a little bit of room to move the side plates in and out a little bit so that I could adjust the sort of clamping force down on the camera. So then I basically set it to the loosest setting that I could, so the camera was much more loose now. It wasn't able to flop around on its own sort of accord, but it was definitely much looser than it was when it first came. So I went and tested that out, and honestly the jello got so much worse. It was, the camera must have been shaking around in there or something because it was not looking good. So I went for sort of a middle ground in between the really tight and the really loose, and now I sort of have it set at quite a nice sort of, I don't know what the word is here, like looseness, a nice level of damping basically. So it feels firm, it's not going to move on its own, but it's still fairly easy to move with my fingers, but it feels like it's definitely being held in place and dampened. Now I think the O4 Pro compared to the O3 is definitely a lot more sensitive to vibration and things like that, which is obviously why I was seeing that jello. So moving on from that, like I said, I went somewhere in between and that really improved things a lot. Basically got rid of most of the jello, but I was still experiencing a lot of jello with high throttle punches. So it was time to take a deeper look in at all the different things going on here. Something else that I did that I forgot to mention while I filmed the initial part of this video is I actually also took my O4 Pro camera out and I checked to make sure that the sensor was tight and the lens was tight, because I thought if any of these are loose, this could also be contributing to the jello. Honestly, the jello was getting really bad at one point. I thought maybe the lens is loose or the sensor is loose. So I took it apart, but everything in there was nice and tight. So that wasn't the issue. Now, when I fitted the O4 Pro, I actually also changed my antenna on my ELRS receiver. So I took a few other things apart in there. So I took the top plate back off and went inside to check the flight controller and things around that area. So I wanted to make sure there was no wires that were close to or touching the gyro chip, because if that was happening, I could be getting noise, especially when high throttle things are vibrating a bit more, and it could be interrupting the gyro chip, giving me some sort of false readings and in turn jello. There weren't actually any wires close by, but I did adjust my flight controller mounting because I took it apart just to change everything out. And when I put it back together, I think I tightened it up a little bit too much. There was a the rubber grommets were squeezed a little bit more than I would have liked them to be, so I loosened them off a little bit just to give that flight controller and ESC a little bit more damping and a little bit sort of a freer connection to the frame, so it wasn't going to be absorbing as much of those high frequency vibrations at high throttle output, and that made a massive difference too. So that in turn again reduced the Jello coming through. So you can see here that Jello is sometimes a factor of a lot of different things, and you just have to work through one by one in order to get to the cause of it. So that pretty much fixed almost all the Jello. There's still a little bit left in there, but I kind of was just putting that little bit left down to really high shutter speeds and rolling shutter Jello, because if you have extremely high shutter speeds, the rolling shutter effect can sometimes look like Jello too. It's a weird phenomenon, but it can happen. So I then slapped on an ND filter, put the settings in that I was going to be running on a regular basis for sort of cinematic footage, because I'm going to be capturing on the O4 Pro because it's honestly such a good camera. And then that basically fixed all of my Jello issues. So yeah, to round everything up, what I basically did is I went for somewhere in between a really soft mount and quite a firm mounting, so it's nicely dampened. I think that's the best way to go. Try and find a happy medium. When you put these screws in as well on the side plates, don't go crazy on them. I've got them so they are literally wound in so they just start to touch the silicon plates. I don't want them squeezing too much because it just makes things too firm. And well, that's from my experience. You might experience differently, but it's very, very sensitive and you have to get the mounting just right. Also make sure that your flight controller is mounted correctly. It's not overly tight or overly loose, because again, that can have effect on the Jello. Now, one thing else I was going to do is I was going to balance my propellers. I do have a prop balancer on the way. It hasn't arrived yet. And I'm still going to balance my props anyway, because I used to do it all the time with model aircraft, but I never did it in FPV. It just didn't seem like a thing that people did. But I'm going to balance my props anyway, just to make sure, because it's obvious to me that this O4 Pro is extremely sensitive to vibrations, and I'm going to cancel out as many of those as I possibly can. Another thing that can affect vibrations in Jello is antennas. Now, I did run short antennas and long antennas, and it made no difference, so I'm pretty happy that the antennas weren't causing any extra unwanted effects. So yeah, just make sure that your ESC frequency is set to 48 kilohertz. It's very sensitive on the O4 Pro to this. And just make sure that your build is good and everything is absolutely well optimized, and you should be good to go. Now, the footage coming out of the O4 Pro is actually freaking stunning. I've got so used to the Avata 2 footage, and this is exactly the same, but having it in this frame is just next level. So that's going to be something for another video anyways, but that's basically O4 Jello, how I overcame it on the Nazgul Evoque F5, and a few hints and tips that might help you overcome it too. So stay tuned for more O4 Pro content. I've got a lot coming up. I've got comparison between O4 Pro, Avata 2 and O3. I've got sort of ND filter videos coming, cinematic videos coming, all sorts of good stuff. So stay tuned, and yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.